Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The webinar is about to start. For those who've just joined in the last couple of minutes, we'll be using the Q&A feature during the webinar, so please do post any questions you have during the session. If we can't get to them during the webinar, we will answer them at the end. Today's webinar is also being recorded, and this also will be shared with you all after the session. I'd now like to hand over to Rich Seddon, Managing Partner of PMI. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us in these truly unprecedented times. We have a very large number of people on the webinar today, and it's great to see so many past and present PMI clients, friends, and colleagues. You're all very welcome. As my colleague mentioned, we will be using the Q&A feature. These have proved popular in previous runs of this webinar. Please do post during the session, and I'll try and make this session as interactive as possible. So please feel free to pitch those questions as we go forward. The session is also being recorded, and this will be sent out too. I anticipate that the webinar should take about 45 minutes today, depending on how many questions we have, and also how long it takes me to answer. Key variable in this factor. So to introduce myself, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rich Seddon, and I'm Managing Partner at PMI. Please find my full contact details here as well. We're here to help. I'm very happy to talk at any time. So in terms of the webinar today, subject matter is crisis management huddles. What I'm intending to cover is as follows. What are crisis management huddles and how they can be useful? And finally, how to start your own. I'll be giving you some theory about the various sections and some of our thinking about how to respond to crises and how to use huddles effectively to address the factors that are affecting you right now. So, as I mentioned, I'll be talking about crisis management huddles. And what we're trying to do here is be as useful and pragmatic as we possibly can. So we'll show you some summaries here, and as I say, we'll send you the slides afterwards so you can use them as well in your business. Now, I'm sure, like us, many of you are working from home and working remotely. So please, the members of the PMI team are also on here. Please do forgive us any interruptions from Amazon deliveries on doorbells and barking dogs and children, etc. Thankfully, I'm only joined by my cat Tiberius today, who's fast asleep next to me right now. So he hopefully won't be any trouble. So without more ado, I'll press on. I'll start with this slide, which I think is the context for all of the content that I'm going to cover today. Stephen Covey, the management thinker, is widely quoted at the best of times. At the worst of times, which we're in now, I'm using this. I'm using it personally as I manage PMI's response to COVID-19, and I'd encourage you to do the same. And it says, take control of that which you can control. Now, that doesn't mean don't seek or be aware of the things that are outside of your control. What it means is don't seek to control them. And this really helps me focus when times are tough and there's a lot of decisions to be made. We're coming back to this phrase, take control of that which you can control, is where crisis management huddles really come in. And to do so with calm heads. So I thought I'd like to start here by showing you some of our latest thinking around crisis management. There are three elements in our proposition: the defensive elements, the continuity elements, and the offensive elements. Now, I'll take you through each one of those individually, and I'll keep referring back to this as we proceed through the webinar. So the defensive elements. What's in here? This is about protecting our organization and its people and prevent deterioration of the situation if possible. The continuity elements cover those actions that ensure our ability to operate in the immediate and mid-term. And then the often overlooked offensive activities is how in a crisis can we identify opportunities not just to survive, but to thrive. And it's taking these three elements together that we recognize as being a complete and comprehensive way to address the challenges that crises throw at you. So we hope that will be useful, and I'll keep referring back to that as we progress to understand where crisis management huddles fit within this context. So what are crisis management huddles? They're a structured way, and particularly in a crisis situation, huddles are an effective way for teams to review their progress, share the latest knowledge, and update each other on the task status in order to rapidly agree priorities. You'll see lots of reference to speed throughout these slides, but this first point is probably one of the most important. It's about providing structure so that you repeatedly and rigorously review the things that need to be reviewed, whether that's actions or planned actions. Secondly, there's a visual element to them. They're virtual or physical, most likely in the current climate, virtual boards, displaying information that is relevant and useful to understanding and managing a crisis. There are no nice to haves in a crisis management huddle. These are things that you need at your fingertips. And we'll be showing you some tips on virtual huddles later on, how to control the data within them. So, thirdly, they're time-bound. They're short, they're regular, and they're attended. In a crisis management setting, these are not optional. They either matter or they don't. So if they matter, the people that need to be there should be there. And finally, data-driven. Now, I've been finding this simple equation here useful when thinking about crisis management huddles. Accurate data plus rigorous review equals reliable decisions. That's what the huddle is all about, to review your accurate data in a rigorous way in order to make reliable decisions to tackle the crisis facing you and your organization. So why use them? First and foremost, it's to create a routine, to form the basis of your crisis response drumbeat, to talk with evidence and present the right data in the right way to the right people at the right time. Speed in any crisis response is of the essence. So what we're trying to do here by structuring a crisis management huddle is to enable decisions to be made quickly and effectively at the point of need. And finally, it's to manage risks, to reduce the risk of duplication, misunderstanding, or errors, which any after-the-fact analysis of any accident or crisis situation, this is probably one of the key areas of learning that comes out. Areas where data was misinterpreted, there were misunderstandings in the response, or there was duplication. So the crisis management huddles can really help with this by providing this drumbeat and talking with evidence to make sure everyone's on the proverbial same page. So there are 4 fundamentals of a crisis huddle. Now, those of you who are familiar with huddles, and certainly PMI's teaching of huddles, will recognize that this is an addition. This is specifically for crisis management huddles, the slide I'm about to show you. So there are 4 elements. There's the listening element, the measurement element, the planning element, and the communication. So what are we listening to? We're listening to your people, the external environment, your processes, and your stakeholders. We're measuring the key actions that we've agreed, be it the day before, the hour before, measuring your key processes, and critically measuring the results of your actions that you've taken since the last time you huddled. And you're planning your next steps. You're planning the resources you need, you're agreeing timelines and responsibilities. And you can start getting a sense of this drumbeat coming in here. And finally, you're communicating with each other, with your business, and with your stakeholders. So again, we'll come back to this and you will see some examples of boards, and we'll overlay these models together. We've got the crisis management 3 elements, and then we've got the 4 elements of the 4 fundamentals of the crisis huddle: how you listen, you measure, you plan, and you communicate. And those of you of a certain vintage will recognize this quote. It's a Radiohead quote from one of their songs in the 90s. Ultimately, what we're trying to do here in a crisis management huddle is to avoid alarms and surprises. So no alarms and no surprises, please. It has a firm role to play in a crisis management huddle. So there's 3 questions to ask yourself using the originally named 3-question model. So where do you start? What is the problem you're trying to solve? Why are you having these huddles? What are they trying to accomplish? And it's critical that you agree this before starting. Don't be tempted to just dive in. And answering question 2, how will we know a change is an improvement? This creates your baseline. What are the things we need to know? And if so, how do we understand where we are today? And this demands theories and prediction before action. This doesn't mean, and please don't misinterpret this, that this means this needs to take a long time. It does not. These can be done quickly, but they're important disciplines, and any effective response to a crisis requires discipline. And recognizing that to resolve any crisis and to contend with any crisis, there will be multiple solutions. Using these 3 questions, understanding what you're trying to accomplish, how you know change and improvement, and therefore what changes can you make that will result in an improvement, will generate multiple solutions, but you're clearly deciding using these 3 questions which ones you're trying to test. And that applies to the huddle structure itself. And as I just said, and finally, using PDSA to rapidly as possible provide the answers to question 2. How we know that the actions we're taking through our huddles and our crisis response are resulting in an improvement. So let's dive straight into the first element, crisis metrics. In a crisis, clear measures can help you to establish your priorities and set realistic goals. There's very little room for hope in these things. You have to set realistic goals. So we're not going to hope we're going to achieve something. You need to set realistic goals and measure whether we've achieved them. Provide a shared understanding of what we're trying to achieve. Assess the results of your actions and assess whether or not those changes have resulted in improvement, and determine whether the gains you've made one day have been maintained the next. And as ever, in any circumstance, but especially in a crisis, these metrics and metrics of any kind are most effective when being used for learning. So how do you choose the right metrics? There's 4 key elements here: understanding the voice of the customer, agreeing the lagging measures and the KPIs, creating your leading measures, and agreeing the right frequency in which to collect and report that data. So I'll take you through each one of these 4 separately. So understanding the voice of your customer within your huddle and pulling this into your huddle board. So what is it that your customers want and expect? Understand their requirements of the current situation, any service level impacts that might be, and don't forget that customers can always be internal and external. Now, the 2 critical things here around the lagging and leading measures. So lagging measures are indicators of performance that has already happened. Action, therefore, is reactive. It is too late to influence your lagging measures by the time you're reporting them. So they represent the overall performance of your actions and your performance of your processes, but by the time they've occurred, it's too late to affect them. And it's important to be cognizant that any action you take is therefore reactive, as opposed to leading measures, which can tell you what is currently happening today. So an example I regularly use here with lagging measures is how many units did we dispatch, how many customer service cases did we close out yesterday? A leading measure might be, what are today's inbound orders? What are the volumes we need to deal with today? And therefore, your action you take on the leading measures is, by definition, proactive. And in times of crisis, being really clear on that distinction can help. What is it you're trying to accomplish by being reactive as opposed to proactive, and helping you prioritize where your efforts are best spent? Is it on the proactive or is it on the reactive? And finally, agreeing the right data collection frequency. A healthy dose of realism is needed here. In a crisis situation, it's often not possible to gather everything that you might want in an ideal situation. So pick the key things that matter, and be quite ruthless with ruling out other things that in better times and in better environments you might choose to measure. But understanding the frequency related to each one of those is daily appropriate, is hourly appropriate, for example. Being very clear, what are we going to do about it? Is it going to be reactive? Is it going to be proactive action? And therefore, what frequency do we need? And that is entirely dependent on your process that you're managing, your processes that you're managing, unique to your setting, your industry, your business. There is no right or wrong when it comes to frequency. as long as it is this word in bold here, meaningful. As long as that data is meaningful and you can act upon it, then it's relevant. The hints and tips for metrics. Make it visual. Where possible, use summary graphics instead of tables or single values. Time-based, and this is really important to understand your performance over time. Display your data over time and not single data points. So not just yesterday's value, but yesterday's plus the last 7 days, 2 weeks, however long this thing has been going on for. Ensure that you're displaying that over time so you can understand how your performance today or tomorrow or this hour versus the previous hour sits in context in that data. Remember my point earlier on about metrics are most useful when most effective when used for learning. Displaying data over time is your key vehicle in these circumstances for ensuring that you can make the right decisions. So trustworthy, ensure you know and trust the data source. I've lost count of how many times a client says to me, we're just seeking one version of the truth from our data. This comes to the forefront in a crisis situation. Remembering that equation that I mentioned earlier on, reliable decisions require reliable data. Well, here we go, a case in point. They must be easy to collect as well. In a crisis situation, you don't have time to develop an industry to collect and analyze the data sufficiently. That in itself dictates simplicity, and you may have to pull some content out. And remember, removing these nice to haves from the situation. And what you're trying to do is provide focus to ensure the measures you're reporting on are necessary and sufficient, and that is entirely dependent on your setting. And finally, create ownership, so that data can be recognize that data that can be updated by the people in the huddle is more valuable than that that's supplied remotely. So helping the people that are within the huddle understand that data, collect that data if necessary, so that it's clear that when you need to respond to it, you've got a clear owner of it. Okay, so moving into the next element, the board. And we've put board deliberately in inverted commas here, because it doesn't literally mean a board. In certain circumstances, when we're in office environments or factory environments, there is a physical board, but recognizing the current volume of people that are working remotely, virtual boards are coming into their own, and something tells me that's not going to go away. So the Crisis Huddle board then. These 5 elements across the top are typical huddle board elements. Some of you may use things like QDIP, etc. There's multiple varieties of it. We recognize the commonalities here across all the models: people, process, plan, performance, improvement. So what we're trying to do with a board is, again, coming back to this topic of focus. What are the things we're focusing on in order to respond to this crisis? And how do we display that current data to coordinate our response? Well, we take these standard 5, people, process, plan, performance, improvement, and we apply the 4 crisis management lenses: listen, measure, plan, communicate. Combine those 2 together. Like this. So we have across the top the 5 key elements, and then down the left we have the crisis management lenses. So it's bringing these together to really mobilize your huddle boards in a crisis situation. So what are the kind of things we're dealing with here? And again, remember, these slides will be distributed afterwards, so don't worry about capturing the screen grabs. We'll send these out to you so you can look at them properly. In the people area, for example, you've got responding to listening processes, their concerns, ideas, challenges. You're measuring things like absenteeism, illness, particularly relevant in this current crisis, and their working patterns. Thinking about what you need to communicate with your people, and planning resilience, recovery, defensive actions, and so on and so forth as you move across the channels. So under process, we've got the daily process performance that we're listening to. Measuring things like non-conformance, conformance, and communicating if there's been learning particularly relevant in a crisis situation. where it's sharing of best known ways and learning as you've been responding to the crisis. That's what huddles are so good for, because you've got the structure, you're bringing people together, and stepping through these elements really helps that come to the fore. And where I started earlier on talking about structure, well, here it is. And this is ensuring that you're dealing with, overlaying your drumbeat with structure. So you're reviewing the same things today, tomorrow, the next day, to ensure consistent response to the crisis and consistent decisions are made, and good quality decisions are made, and so on and so forth. That moves across the various channels from plan, performance, and improvement. So how do you go about developing these things? You'll be, those of you who are familiar with us at PMI, there'll be no surprises to learn that there's a flip chart involved. In fact, I'm disappointed that this graphic doesn't have post-its littered across it. But think about this: who's the audience and what's important to them? Sketch it up on a flip chart. Don't get hung up about the design in this circumstance. It's that you will not have time in a crisis response to be developing beautiful boards. In a virtual environment, we're recommending clients use things like PowerPoint for a repeated virtual board where your data gets populated into it, and it's on a shared drive where everyone can access it, or SharePoint, etc. But sketch it up, take a photo, share it around with your peers. This is what I think we need. Would this structure work? Send me your comments. And then, and only then, should you start digitalizing it for sharing and daily review. So a quick example here. So we've got the elements that I just showed you earlier on, overlaying some typical content. So here we have an under people, for example, and the people listen element. Current challenges: some people have challenges in the new home working situation. What's the idea to review that? Methods such as Zoom, which we're using today. And what are we measuring? So we've got 45 people, up 7% ill, of which 13, so on and so forth. 2 shift fields. And what we're doing about making this data repeatable is ensuring that we can make decisions repeatedly and reliably. So we overlay the ideas and the concepts with the current data. Very simple data required, and visual displays in order to help that. So this is very comprehensive. We're not saying fill every element of it from day one. Clearly that wouldn't be appropriate. So do pick and choose from the elements as your crisis develops and your crisis response develops. Okay, so just a reminder, as I'm progressing through these slides, I'm aware I'm going at a fair pace. Please do ask questions as we go along. I have some dutiful assistants on hand managing the Q&A boards. Very happy to take questions as we proceed. If there's anything that I'm going through that's not clear, please don't hesitate to shout up, and I'd be very happy to review. Okay, so moving on from the example board is the next element, which is the meeting itself. So we've talked about metrics, we've talked about the boards. Now I'm going to talk about the meeting itself, how to manage those. So what's it for? Crisis Huddle meeting. It's the punctuation point fundamentally in understanding the current and predicted performance. The purpose is to encourage constructive challenge and make priorities visible for the whole team, removing the power of assumption from crisis response. And again, in lots of circumstances, when crises and accidents are reviewed, this is one of the key success factors of successful crisis management, ensuring that your whole team are aware of the same priorities in real time. And enabling real-time status updates and sharing learning as you go through a crisis and understanding. And coming back to my Radiohead lyrics earlier on, no surprises. So here in the meeting is where the formula really comes to the fore. Accurate data plus rigorous review equals reliable decisions, which enables us to respond to crises more effectively. So we've got 3 stages of the performance huddle meeting itself: before, during, and after. So before the huddle meeting itself, Huddle data owners are updating their data and status indicators and reviewing the actions that were agreed previously. During the huddle, actions must be recorded in a reliable and rigorous way, and we've got a suggestion in one of the later slides as to how to do that. And you're operating the huddle process. Again, I'll show you a typical process for operating a huddle, crisis management huddle. And we're asking questions of inquiry and making decisions using data, wherever it is possibly available. And then afterwards, we're going to see where the work really happens, we're completing those actions, and we're escalating where necessary for support. Here's some thoughts about tiers and timings. So we've got clients at the moment deploying multi-tiered crisis management huddles from top to bottom, from bottom to top of an organization. And here's some typical thoughts as you progress through a day. And you'll notice some indicative timings here. In a crisis management setting, we don't expect crisis management huddles to take more than 20 to 30 minutes. These are not problem-solving sessions. These are communication and review sessions. And that distinction is important, as it is human nature to dive into solving the problem there and then. If that's the case, it needs to be taken immediately offline, and there's nothing wrong with solving the problem in real time, but not in the review meeting, which is what the crisis management huddle is for, enabling you to share priorities and set priorities, review performance, and understand and predict performance going forward. So a typical tiering structure looks something like this, with a classic organization chart there. And between the hours of 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock, there's 4 different sets of huddles have been held, starting at 8, running up through 9, with each one escalating to the next any decisions or any key communication or updates that are required. I can see one of my colleagues has just raised a hand. Susanna, would you like to join me?
Yes, thanks, Rich. So it's a question that's been asked. It's partly observational, but also looking for a bit of insight. What they're saying is that in their organisation, this tends to be in reverse. So it tends to start with the executive team cascading down the organisation. Just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
I do. Yeah, so I challenge that theory quite strongly. And the reason I would challenge that theory and seek to reverse it is the place where the work is done in this kind of organization that you've got on screen here, the upwards communication should be followed by downwards communication in that order to enable the leaders in the executive to have the most relevant and up-to-date information from the so-called coalface. Doing it in reverse means you're constantly and always out of date. And that's where that would be my response to that. And there is an overlay on this slide here, which I'm just about to put on. There we go, it's coming up, which is the feedback loop coming back down. And if you do it in reverse, which is not unusual, but it is flawed, if you do it in reverse, the executive making the decisions are doing so with out of date information. Which means it places the onus in this structure on those escalation cycles upwards of informing and the feedback loops down being well-defined, timely, and clear. That's the secret success of this, but there's been many a flawed decision made where it's in reverse and coming downwards and flowing down the organization. And so, yeah, I'd respond to that quite robustly and encourage alternative thinking on that one. Thanks for the question. Okay, so some hints and tips for running the huddles. Stick to time. In any crisis situation, time is of the essence. And in a prolonged crisis, like the one we're currently dealing with, everyone has plenty to do and they don't need to be tied up in multiple meetings. Hence, it is important to stick to time. So if you say it's going to take 20 minutes, it should take 20 minutes. And any issues that need taking offline can be taken offline. So focus on the essentials, check understanding continuously. If you have any kind of inkling that someone has misunderstood something or is misinterpreting some data or the situation, clarify it. There and then. It's time to put egos aside in that circumstance. Challenge in a constructive manner will help you make better decisions. So make sure the people in the huddle that you communicate and understand with understand any charts that you're putting up. Again, I've lost track of the number of times when I asked clients what to describe this data that they receive day in, day out on a chart. What's this all about? And they'll look at me slightly perplexed and think, and won't be able to actually understand it. So in the huddle, in the crisis huddle situation, do make sure any charts are understood. And capturing actions. Accountability is utterly critical to crisis management response. We recommend in PMI using Microsoft Planner, which anyone that uses Office 365 will have available. And if you don't, do nag your IT teams to release it to you. Microsoft Planner is one of the easiest and simplest routes. There are multiple others on the market, obviously. We recommend Planner because it's simple, it's really easy to use, it's visual, and enables you to record actions visually so everyone can see and hold the action taker to account and share those out. And it's got escalations and tiering and responsibilities and things within there that can be done in a couple of clicks without anyone needing to take the time-consuming role of writing up minutes and sharing those out afterwards. Okay, so tips for virtual huddles. Now we're all learning a great deal about working permanently remotely at the moment, and Tiberius is continuing to behave here, I'm pleased to say. But if you are using videos or teleconferences, remember to do things like set up the recurring meetings and put the links to the data within the invites. It saves time. Again, think about this timeliness thing. Having the links in the meeting invite itself means no one needs to open anything up. They don't need to wait while you click around and try and find the latest report buried in your emails from 9:30 this morning. Do use cameras if possible and bandwidth permitting. Using a shared document system such as Microsoft Teams, SharePoint or OneDrive or similar, so that everyone has a shared reference point and you're not sharing the data on your own, saving the data on your own desktop. Again, this is about speed, this is about shared communication. There's multiple systems out there, as I'm sure you're all using, Teams, Zoom, Skype, etc., etc. And often useful having the backup app. So all of the above systems have apps available for mobiles. So if you can't be at your computer for the crisis management huddle, remember my point I mentioned very early on. If these things matter, then they need to happen and you need to attend. So make your life easier and get the app installed as well. And finally, out of order here in my animation, apologies. Keep yourself off mute in a crisis management huddle. No matter how noisy the background is, a crisis management huddle needs to be free-flowing. We've all experienced in the past few weeks, I'm absolutely sure, the delays caused by someone rummaging around looking for the mute button. In your crisis management huddles, keep yourselves off mute and do strongly encourage everyone to stay off mute so that questions can be free-flowing and discussion dynamic. And finally, I mentioned earlier on with the having something like PowerPoint or Excel as a shared shared slide deck for your virtual board. If you have that sitting on a system like SharePoint, then it's up to date, real time, and there's no question about versions. There's no confusion around versions, and you know you're all looking at the latest one. And keep it visible during and after the huddle so everyone can dip in. SharePoint's particularly good at that because of its multi-user ability, and multiple people can be in the documents at the same time. And above everything else, keep it slick and easy to use. We're not in this to create industries around huddles and huddle data collection. It must be easy, and easy often means simple in these scenarios. Use your process and keep to time. So on that note, I want to talk to you about the huddle process itself. This is the final element. So huddles and crisis management huddles particularly don't have agendas, they have process flowcharts. I'm going to come back to that very first point I made earlier on about the structure. Your structure is provided by all of the elements I've taken you through before, and it's reinforced and operated by the process itself. It should take you no more than 20 to 30 minutes to create your flowchart. Don't agonize about it. It doesn't need to be beautiful and perfect. Think about what we're trying to accomplish by having this huddle. That becomes your huddle purpose. And then think about that question of relevance. Set your frequency. So is it hourly? Is it daily? Is it weekly? In many circumstances at the moment, many of our clients are operating twice daily huddles, or in a multi-shift environment 3 times on each shift changeover, which is taking the data from the previous shift and the previous shift time period and feeding it in. What do we need to do proactively for the next huddle, for the next time period? So clarify your frequency. Again, there is no one right way here. It is whatever's appropriate. And define each step in your huddle meeting. Of course, those of you who know us will always come back to verb noun, make sure it's repeatable. So review safety data, not safety data. Review today's plan exceptions, not plan exceptions. So add any notes that you think will be useful to the flowcharts, hints and tips. And this 5th point, again, don't misinterpret this, please, as a bureaucratic exercise. Just get going fast. This will enable you to get going fast, and it'll also mean it's repeatable no matter who's running it each day or which shift it appears on. You've got a consistent, standardized process, which again, crises demand rigor in order to make effective decisions. And that's where the process, simple process flowchart such as this comes into its own. So you can see on this example here, I'll just talk you through. We've got the name of the particular process, process owner on there. When's it happening? In this circumstance, 8 o'clock till 8:20 and 1500 till 1520. And the purpose is to review current recovery efforts, agree our priorities today, and share latest data. Nothing else. It is not to check in on the status of some other extraneous process or consider any other surrounding information. It's to review these issues that we consider are the things that we need to manage to respond to this crisis. So you can see the simple process here, 2 swim lanes, 1 notes column. Swim lanes involving updating the boards, preparing your comments, confirming the purpose, appointing an action recorder, doing this every time, day in, day out, huddle in, huddle out, reviewing the last huddle's actions. And then in this particular circumstance, the key elements that have been identified that they need to respond to in this crisis is the safety data, any exceptions to the plan that they made yesterday, quality data, and performance data. Has everything been reviewed? Yes, it has. Move on. And that's the level of the structure that successful crisis huddles demand. And done effectively with these 4 elements that I've taken you through so far, these will greatly aid decision making, which is ultimately what we're trying to do. Okay. So
Rich, can I just...
Sorry, go ahead. I think I can see Joe's question as well. Hi, Joe. Great. How are you doing? Who said I wasn't capable of multitasking? Okay, so we've got a question here on the board, just about in terms of Joe's question is, how do you ensure enough time is spent on offensive actions and not spent on the defensive and continuity aspects? A great question, Joe. Really key. And as I mentioned earlier on, how often do we ignore the 3rd circle in that model, where we don't focus on the offensive aspects at all? So typically, how to deal with that? It needs its own space, which could be in the process. It could be in a huddle of its own variety, of its own making. So don't think that this means you can only have one of these. So there might be we've seen this in a couple of examples, daily huddles, crisis management huddles are on the defensive and continuity initially, and there's a weekly or bi-weekly offensive crisis management huddle. But the key thing is that you interact with the 2 together. So each one knows the other exists, and you have a step in your process to feed into one or the other. So things like sharing the learning, generating the ideas, you'd have a process step in here. Is there anything we need to feed into the offensive huddle, for example? And there is a risk that if you try and do it at the same time as dealing with the other two, the defensive and the continuity actions, it'll get squeezed out. So just watch for that would be my advice. And if necessary, create its own structure. All too often, that's not done in real time and it's left until after the event. For me, that's missing a key element and a key opportunity as well. And similarly, when I say they should feed into each other, I do mean that both ways. That if you do have an offensive huddle offensive action huddle, it should absolutely feed into the defensive and continuity aspects. So, in conclusion, 8 key points how to get going here. First of all, agree the huddle purpose. Second, agree your metrics to address the purpose. Keep relaying that back to the purpose. Agree attendees, the roles, responsibilities, and then draft them up. And remember the 4 lenses: listen, measure, plan, communicate. Step 5 is where you agree the frequency, and it's in this order deliberately. Don't start with the frequency, start with the purpose. Answer the frequency once you know what you're reviewing. Very common reaction is, we must have a daily conference call on this thing every day. We don't know whether that's right or wrong, but we're going to have it every day. Do go through these steps in this order. We've thought about this quite carefully, and it helps you to make more reliable decisions and not waste people's time on endless meetings. Once you've agreed the frequency, and if you are doing tiered huddles, schedule the tiered huddles. Write your huddle flowchart, and without more pause for thought, run the thing. And by running it, you'll learn what's working well, and then move on to step 8, refine it and run it again and again and again. Don't worry about getting this thing, whether it's the boards, your metrics, or the process itself. Don't worry about it being perfect and polished. There just isn't time. What you're looking for here is structure. What you need to be is agile and fleet of foot in order to refine and run these things effectively. So we'll leave you there with those tips. Please do send over any Q&A, and we will seek to answer those afterwards. And thank you very much for attending. I do hope that's been useful. We will send out the slide decks, as we've already mentioned, and we'll send out the recording as well, so you've got that accessible. Thanks ever so much for attending. Please stay safe and stay home this weekend.